Hello, my name is Patricia Heberer-Rice. I'm the director of the Senior Historian's Office in the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I'm the moderator of this morning's panel, which focuses on the critical aspects attending the refugee crisis in Austria following the Anschluss in March of 1938 with Germany. In 1938, Austria had a Jewish population of about 192,000, representing about 4% of the population, most of those centered in the capital, Vienna. And as we heard from the minister from the embassy, this was an important center for Jewish education, the arts and cultures, and for the Zionist movement. The brutal backlash directed against Austrian Jews in the wake of the Anschluss was a violent harbinger for what was to come. A violence that most German Jews only first would encounter with Kristallnacht a few months later, a violence that persuaded many Austrian Jews to flee the country. Between 1938 and 1940, 117,000 Jews left their country of Austria. 64,500 Jews, Austrian Jews, are thought to have died in the Holocaust. And our speakers this morning will discuss and outline this dark chapter in Austrian history. So let me introduce them and get straight away to what they're going to share with us. Our first speaker is Rebecca Erbelding. Dr. Rebecca Erbelding is an historian at the Levine Center for Holocaust Education here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In this capacity, she served as the lead historian for the museum's most recent special exhibition, a highly acclaimed exhibition, Americans and the Holocaust, on display until late 2021. So go down and see it downstairs, I guess on this level, when you get a chance, perhaps at lunchtime. She holds a bachelor's in arts from Mary Washington University and a master's and a PhD with honors from George Mason University. Dr. Erbelding has served at the museum since 2003 in several capacities and has previously held positions as an archivist and curator. Her recent book, Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, published with Doubleday in 2018, won that year's National Jewish Book Award. Today she'll be discussing the US and the refugee crisis in the late 1930s. Our next speaker, next to her, is Ilana Offenberger. She is a lecturer at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. She holds a BA in German Studies, cum laude from Skidmore College, and a PhD from Clark University. She holds many awards and honors, including the first annual Radomir Luza Prize given by the American Friends of the Documentation Center of the Austrian Resistance. The first year I was president of that organization, Go Ilana, as well as a fellowship from our Mandel Center in 2006 to 2007. Her books, The Jews of Nazi Vienna, 1938 through 1945, Rescue and Destruction, came out with Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. Today she'll discuss Resilience and Rescue, the ordinary heroes of the Vienna IKG. Let me pull this a little closer. Next to Dr. Offenberger is Dr. Gerhard Baumgartner, whom we've already heard from. Dr. Baumgartner is, since the year 2014, director of the Documentation Center of the Austrian Resistance. He studied English and history at the University of Vienna. He served as a lecturer at various universities throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, I believe, at Klagenfurt, Vienna, Salzburg, in Budapest. From 2002 to 2003, he served as project leader of the Austrian Historical Commission, and from 2003 to 2008, project leader of the project, and I'll read here the English version, Registration of the Murdered Austrian Roma and Sinti under National Socialism. Among his many books are some of the most recent, The Fate of the European Roma and Sinti During the Holocaust in 2013, and Roma Policies in Austria from 2005 with Florian Freund. Today, Dr. Baumgartner will examine the first documented expulsion of Jewish citizens from the territory of the Third Reich in March and April 1938. And finally, our final speaker is Dr. Winfried Garscha, known to all of us who like him and love him as Friedel. Dr. Garscha was senior historian at the Documentation Center of the Austrian Resistance until 2018 and is co-director of the Austrian Research Agency for Post-War Trials. He studied history and linguistics at the University of Vienna with a PhD in 1983, discussing the Anschluss movement in the 1920s and 1930s in Germany and Austria. He's cited 3 articles that have come out recently concerning the discussion he's going to have today about expulsion and extermination of Austrian Jews. I'll read there, if you don't mind, Friedel, the English version of those titles. In 2017, Deportations to Poland, the transfer of Viennese Jews and Jewesses to the general government. In 2018, Deportation as Expulsion, Eichmann's Nisko experiment of 1939 in the context of National Socialist ethnic cleansing. And finally, 2019, I believe this is coming out in the yearbook in 2 weeks' time, a discussion of the extermination process in Mali Trostinets, a killing site near Minsk where gas vans were used to gas many, many of the Austrian Jews murdered in that first deportations from Vienna. And today, Dr. Garscha will discuss the deportation and extermination of Austrian Jews, the state of research. And now we'll turn to our first speaker, Rebecca Erbelding.
Good morning, everyone. My brief talk about... Hey, Betsy, this is the afternoon program. I can riff on Quakers helping Jews flee Nazi Vienna, but it wouldn't be as good as what Bettina's going to do.
That's true.
Yeah, she'll be better at it than me. Apologies. Well, I'll start talking because my introduction doesn't need a slide.
But it's almost here.
Yeah. What I hope I'm going to do is really set the stage for the rest of the presenters today. In April 1941, Otto Frank, the father of the famous diarist Anne Frank, who to be fair was not Austrian, wrote to a friend, "I'm forced to look out for immigration, and as far as I can see, USA is the only country we could go to." He wasn't alone. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees looked to the United States, particularly after the 1939 White Paper limited immigration to Palestine. But immigration to the United States was limited too, and most of these limits began decades before the refugee crisis. In the first 15 years of the 20th century, an average of about 900,000 people immigrated to the United States every year. It was so large that the United States population grew almost 1% every year just through immigration, through newly arrived refugees that year. On average, between 40 and 50% of these immigrants listed their racial category as either Polish, Italian, or Hebrew. But during World War I, immigration dropped as it became much more difficult to get out of Europe. And by the time the war was over, the US Congress was determined to limit immigration legally. The United States became deeply isolationist. It did not join the League of Nations after World War I, and throughout the 1920s, the US demilitarized, vowing to never go to war again. Isolationists feared large numbers of foreign-born, with their close ties to life overseas, that they might drag the United States into foreign war. And wherever Americans looked, they saw foreign-born people as a threat. The Spanish flu was thought to be an imported disease. Fears surrounding the Russian Revolution and Bolsheviks and a wave of anarchist bombings in the United States led to Red Scares and roundups and deportations of anarchists and activists, many of whom were thought to be immigrants or Jews or both. The United States was segregated by race, legally in many places, and by redlining in others. The Ku Klux Klan, which boasted 2.5 million members in 1923, attacked not just African Americans, but Jews and Catholics and foreigners with their 100% Americans campaign. Moreover, many Americans, particularly intellectuals and academics, believed in eugenic pseudoscience, the idea that some people are biologically better than others, and that by cultivating good racial stock, the country can prevent the desired white Protestant culture from being soiled by immigration. So these factors and many others led to the Johnson Reid Act of 1924. This act set numerical limits on immigration to the United States each year, capped at a little more than 153,000 people per year. Countries outside the Western Hemisphere had quotas, a percentage designated for each country of that 153,000 people. The national origins quotas, as they were called, were in place in the US until 1965. These quotas were maximums. They were not goals to hit. There was no refugee or asylum policy. So while we'll use refugee and immigrant fairly interchangeably, many of us will today, the US had no refugee exceptions. Everyone is coming under US law as an immigrant and subjected to the same slow, deliberate process set out in the Johnson Reid Act. And importantly, the State Department issued immigration visas in the applicant's country of residence. So if you were applying, he or she had to apply and wait there until his or her turn came to present his paperwork. Great Britain and Germany had the highest percentage of the quota, since these eugenicists who wrote the Johnson Reid Act saw these immigrants as reliably white and Protestant and easily assimilated into the United States. 12% of the quota was reserved for people from Southern and Eastern Europe and less than 2% for elsewhere. Some countries had quotas of 100 people per year. The entire continent of Africa had 1,100 visas allocated for it per year. The Johnson Reid Act also codified an Asiatic barred zone, which is defined by latitude and longitude. And if you were born within that zone, you are not eligible for immigration to the United States at all. There are no new laws passed in the 1930s to either let more Jews in or keep Jews out. By severely limiting immigration in the mid-1920s, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, the Johnson Reid Act had already done that. In 1929, the United States and a lot of the world descended into economic depression. President Herbert Hoover at the time instructed the State Department to make sure that immigrants were not likely to become a public charge, and immigration plummeted. And you can see how that manifested. Here is the overall quota immigration to the United States from 1925 to 1929. You can see that they then lowered the number to that 153,000 that I was talking about. And you can see that by 1933, 8,220 immigrants entered the United States, the lowest number in recorded immigration history. In March 1933, President Roosevelt took the oath of office, promising his country a New Deal, and said that the only thing Americans had to fear was fear itself. At this point, 25% of the American workforce was unemployed. Despite this domestic economic crisis, though, Americans are reading articles about Nazi Germany and its new leader, Adolf Hitler, and about the persecution of German Jews on the front page of newspapers nationwide. This is a protest against book burning held in Chicago in May 1933. But after this initial burst, after the spring and summer and all of the newspaper headlines, domestic issues started to take the fore, and the persecution of the Jews largely slipped out of the headlines of American newspapers. Throughout the 1930s, however, more than 90,000 Germans sat on the waiting list for immigration to the United States. The State Department slowly began to allow for increased immigration, but these quotas are far from filled from Germany. In 1933 and 1934, the first full quota year after Hitler took power, only a little more than 4,000 American immigration visas were issued to people born in Germany, out of a possible 25,957. Often students ask, why didn't the Jews just leave? And the answer is that it was hard to leave, and it was even more difficult to obtain permission to come. Potential immigrants had to prove their identities with birth certificates, military discharge papers, passports. They had to show that they were good citizens with certificates from the German police and often letters attesting to their moral character. They needed to pass a medical exam from a State Department-approved physician. And they still had to prove that they would not be a financial burden, which was often the most difficult obstacle to overcome, since the Nazis established severe taxes, taking a majority of an individual's net worth prior to granting permission to leave the country. So would-be immigrants had to obtain a financial sponsor, an American citizen who had to submit tax returns, bank statements, and employer letters to show that they would and could support an immigrant. Some of these documents had expiration dates, or needed to be collected in a specific order. The ramifications for getting it wrong were very real. The journalist Dorothy Thompson, as you can see here, wrote, "It's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death." In March 1938, as you all know, Germany annexed Austria, bringing another 192,000 Jews under German control. The US consulate in Vienna went from issuing 15 visas per month to seeing thousands line up every day to join the waiting list. President Roosevelt combined the German and Austrian quotas, but that still only meant that 27,370 could immigrate every year. Roosevelt also called an international conference in Evian, France. 32 nations attended in July 1938, most declaring in very polite diplomatic language that they could not take more immigrants for economic reasons. Or, and some were much more blunt about this, they were uninterested in importing a racial problem. After the conference, some countries worried they'd be pressured to take Jewish refugees, either shut down immigration entirely or change their laws specifically to keep these particular refugees out. The Kristallnacht attacks in November 1938 were headline news in the United States for weeks, with larger font than coverage of the 1938 midterm elections or the 20th anniversary of the end of World War I, which also happened the same week as Kristallnacht. President Roosevelt publicly condemned the attacks. He summoned the U.S. ambassador in Berlin back for consultation, and the U.S. was the only country to remove its ambassador in protest. Following Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins' suggestion, he also announced that Germans on visitors' visas could remain in the United States indefinitely if they did not feel safe returning home. Polls taken in late November 1938 show that Americans overwhelmingly, 94% of them, disapproved of the Nazi treatment of Jews, yet only 21% thought the United States should bring more Jewish immigrants into the country. And as I said, thousands had joined the waiting list to immigrate to the United States. Germany, which now included Austria, had the second largest quota of any country in the world. And in 1939, that quota was entirely filled. But in the 15 months between the Anschluss and June 1939, more than 160,000 people, most of them Jews, joined the German quota waiting list for a U.S. immigration visa. 160,000. The war had not even begun yet. Europeans everywhere were getting nervous. In Romania, as you can see, the waiting list was already 43 years long. Congress was bipartisan in their unwillingness to adjust the immigration laws. The situation was so bad that in April 1938, right after the Anschluss, Jewish congressmen got together and decided amongst themselves that none of them were going to introduce any new immigration legislation. Even having the debate risked bills that would further restrict immigration, and those bills they thought were much more likely to pass. The members of Congress who favored immigration restriction, they were echoing public opinion. In January 1939, Americans were asked if they wanted their member of Congress to open the doors of the United States to more European refugees, and as you can see, only 9% said yes. President Roosevelt was a politician. He was not a humanitarian. Although Eleanor consistently voiced her support for Jewish refugees, he prioritized recovery from the Great Depression, and once World War II broke out in Europe, the victory of the Allied forces. He did not speak up to encourage immigration. In May 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. By mid-June, France had fallen, frighteningly quickly. Americans saw photos of Hitler on top of the Eiffel Tower and realized that Great Britain was the only bulwark between Nazi Germany and the United States. Americans began to worry that the United States was vulnerable to a fifth column, Nazi spies and saboteurs waiting to bring the country down. The FBI began receiving thousands of tips a day from people who suspected their neighbors might be spies or involved in sabotage. A week after France surrendered, the State Department issued new instructions to consulates abroad, telling them to deny visas to any immigrant for whom there was any doubt whatsoever. This was not an act. This was not anti-Semitism disguised. The fears were shared across the political spectrum and were supported by refugee organizations. So when the State Department started requiring additional screening, very few Americans complained about this. Roosevelt capitalized on this fear in order to encourage war preparedness. And so he commented that Jewish refugees could be Trojan horses, their loved ones back in Germany held hostage in exchange for acts of spying and sabotage. By June 1941, World War II was nearly 2 years old. The American public still didn't want to get involved, but staying out seemed less and less likely. All immigration applications now had to receive approval from an interdepartmental visa review committee in Washington. Due to espionage fears, the United States ordered German consulates in America to close, and the Nazis retaliated and ordered US consulates to close in occupied territory. So would-be immigrants suddenly had no access to the US diplomats who could grant visas. After October 1941, Nazi Germany outlawed immigration from occupied territory. Although the doors to the United States never officially closed, this is really the end of the refugee crisis. There is one more important factor worth mentioning that refugees had to consider: the physical difficulty of escaping a continent at war. The war impacted the number of passenger vessels that could cross the Atlantic. For instance, the Queen Mary, which was the fastest ship at sea, could make the crossing in 5 days. Between March 1938 and the Anschluss and September 1939 and the outbreak of war in Europe, the Queen Mary carried 6,211 self-identified Jewish refugees immigrating to the United States over 34 voyages. When the war broke out, the British immediately converted her into a troop ship. When Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands, aerial bombings over the port of Rotterdam set fire to 2 passenger ships, which had together carried 7,627 Jewish refugees to the United States in the 2 years since the Anschluss. By September 1940, ports in Germany, Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France had all closed to US-bound transportation, and Lisbon became the major port of departure. Between March 1938 and June 1940, 4 Jewish refugees immigrated to the United States from Lisbon. Between June 1940 and October 1941, 11,249 did so. You can see the impact of the war on this slide. 487 ships carried self-identified Jewish refugees to the United States in the first 10 months of 1939. 2 years later, only 88 ships could make the crossing, almost all of them from Lisbon. I apologize for how much I have crammed into this talk, but I hope I've explained and conveyed the ever-changing chaos faced by Jewish refugees seeking to immigrate to the United States. And yet, despite the restrictive immigration quotas, despite the difficulty in escaping a continent at war, despite American isolationism, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigrant sentiment, despite all of the barriers thrown up by the Nazis and their collaborators, between 180 and 220,000 refugees fleeing Nazism successfully entered the United States as permanent immigrants, more than any other country in the world. Had these factors not been in place, however, there could have been many more.
So good morning. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today. I'd like to thank Betsy Anthony and the museum and all the other sponsors for inviting me to speak on the subject, fleeing the Nazis. I would like to acknowledge the many important persons who are here with us today. People who have traveled from near and far to participate in and attend this symposium. I would also like to note for all of us that within this audience, we have many persons who lived through this history, persons who fled the Nazis, and whose presence among us is invaluable. A particular thanks I would like to extend to George Chushka. So today, with the short time that I am provided, I seek to provide you with a snapshot of the Vienna Jewish community during the first years of the Nazi occupation of Austria. This snapshot is in no way intended to oversimplify a complex subject matter, but rather to stimulate further inquiry into the actions of the ordinary victims of the Holocaust. This snapshot emerges after deliberate scrutiny and analysis of multiple archival collections, personal papers and documents, survivor testimony, etc. one also cannot leave out the statistics and the numbers and what they tell us about this time period. So in the following talk, I seek to accomplish three things: to provide you with a brief historical timeline of the IKG's work, to argue that these ordinary persons who helped rescue their community deserve our attention and might be recognized as ordinary heroes. And number three, I hope to leave you with many questions. I would also like to note that the photographs that you will see in the following presentation are all courtesy of the IKG Vienna, the Austrian National Library, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So what was the IKG? The IKG, short for Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Wien, is the Jewish community of Vienna. It was constituted in 1852, although Jewish life in Vienna predates the community by over 5 centuries. The IKG still exists today. The IKG slogan that you see overhead carries a very different meaning for me now than when I first began my research. The IKG was not just an institution, but a unified body of workers who, under extreme duress, responded to their circumstances with dignity, choosing to work together to facilitate the greater good of the entire community. Here we see a group of individuals who put the needs of others ahead of their own. The results of their actions resonate far beyond that immediate time and place. On the 18th of March 1938, 5 days after the German takeover of Austria, the Nazis raided the IKG headquarters on Seitenstädtengasse in Vienna's first district, dismissed the workers, and shut down the offices indefinitely. This was part of the Anschluss pogrom that ensued in the weeks and months following the official annexation of Austria. The Anschluss pogrom included, but was not limited to, the public humiliation and harassment of Jews, forced labor details, both random and planned arrests, house raids, disenfranchisement, expropriation, and other Nazi methods intended to drive the Jewish community to deep despair and panic. Indeed, the number of suicides skyrocketed during this time period. Here we have seen some images of the dissolution of the community offices from various perspectives, both the bird's eye view and up close, outside and now inside the offices of the Jewish community. This next image may be familiar to many of you. To me, it represents the sheer desperation and the magnitude of the situation at hand. Jews standing outside the police station seeking the proper exit papers to flee the country. As we know now, standing in this line was just the beginning and not nearly enough to secure escape. In May 1938, Adolf Eichmann reopened the IKG offices and ordered the institution to operate under the strict jurisdiction of the Nazi Party. His goal was to make Austria free of Jews, and he saw the IKG as an essential tool in the process. Here is when we witness a transformative moment. The Jewish community, individuals, and the institution as a whole took action steps to facilitate the escape of the desperate individuals and families that you see in this image. On the 22nd of April at the Gestapo offices, just a short distance from the IKG headquarters, Eichmann held his first formal meeting with Dr. Joseph Löwenherz, a lawyer and the former vice president of the community. Eichmann ordered him to organize a mass emigration project through the IKG. He informed him that the offices would reopen on the 2nd of May, 1938, and he would be the director. As the director, Löwenherz would oversee the general administration of the entire community, but he had several leaders operating directly below him. Above in this diagram, it reveals the new power structure of the community and its leadership. There were many offices involved, and each office had its own director and staff. Preliminary research suggests that the majority of these initial staff members did not register themselves for emigration, but worked for the IKG to help others flee. When the community reopened on the 2nd of May, there were 300 volunteers at its disposal, eager to help serve. There was also a large staff of paid employees, some who had worked previously for the community, and others who were newly appointed. Most of the latter came to work for the community after being dismissed from their former posts. These ordinary men and women, young and old, labored 10 to 12 hours a day. Those who were employed worked practically for free. They received no overtime, no summer leave, no pension. But most individuals did not work for the IKG for money. They worked because they saw it as an opportunity to be part of something, to be part of a community. Hopelessness ran rampant. Working for the IKG provided people with a welcome opportunity to keep busy. On the 11th of May, at 5 o'clock in the evening, just about 1 week after the offices were reopened, a very important meeting took place at the conference room of the main community headquarters. During this meeting, which Löwenherz directed, there were 71 persons representing 70 different Jewish institutions throughout Vienna, directors and managers from orphanages, kindergartens, homes for the blind, homes for the widows, soup kitchens, charities, and so forth. After a very brief greeting, Dr. Löwenherz addressed the issue at hand, the new structure of the IKG institution under German demand. Quote, "Under order from the Gestapo, all Jewish organizations are to come under the supervision of the IKG, and no move will be made without consent of the community." Löwenherz reminded his attendees that cooperating was in their favor. This will make the situation easier for the authorities, as it will for the community. Once the IKG was reestablished, the leadership began to carry out its work with 3 main objectives in mind. Get the Jews out of Austria, provide social care for them prior to departure, and care for the sick and the elderly who proved unfit for emigration. Not one of these tasks was simple. The many Jews seeking to emigrate from Austria faced a plethora of questions and much confusion. Emigration included so many stages: where to go, what new trade to learn, what language to learn, what to pack. The IKG took on these responsibilities and worked with Jewish relief organizations from around the world to gather information and help Jews emigrate. How would they inform the population of these essential regulations? In the wake of the reestablishment of the IKG, the Germans permitted the community to publish a weekly newspaper. It quickly became the central mouthpiece for the IKG. Its name was the Zionistische Rundschau, or the Zionist Circular, and this name was chosen by Eichmann. The newspaper needed to publicize Nazi decrees and anti-Jewish laws and outline how the orders should be followed. On June 3rd, there was a very important article entitled "Steps for Emigration," which included all the imperative information for future immigrants. There were 10 steps listed, and you can see this is part of that article there. There were 10 steps listed. Each step listed the relevant information, the office to visit, the specific times to visit. Step number 2, which applied to all immigrants, was to fill out an emigration questionnaire. And here I have some samples of what these emigration questionnaires looked like. So the emigration questionnaire, which was free of charge, was to be filled out one per family. These forms were available for pickup in the ground floor of the IKG offices, and after they were completed, they were to be returned to the office. They contained detailed information on each potential immigrant. The first questionnaires to be signed and filed were dated May 9 and 10th, 1938. As each was submitted, it received a number and was filed. The IKG employees could not distribute, receive, or process the emigration questionnaires quickly enough. On an average day, 2,000 to 3,000 people rushed to the emigration office. By June of 1938, over 25,000 of these questionnaires had been filed. Now we skip to the statistics. As can be seen in this diagram above, the efforts of the IKG proved a major success. The work of the ordinary individuals who ran these offices helped facilitate the emigration of over half of the Jewish population within the first 15 months of the Nazi occupation. And there you can see 109,000 Jews that were dispatched between that time period. Furthermore, the efforts are demonstrated in the number of countries to which Viennese Jews were dispatched, to where they emigrated. This map, which was drawn up by the technical department of the IKG, shows exactly how many persons fled and their exact destination. I wasn't able to zoom in, and I'm rushing a bit here, but each of these countries, this was done all by hand, and each country lists the exact number. Here are some further documents with the more precise figures that line up with that map. These are all from the IKG technical headquarters, and these figures show us, again, the wide scope of their endeavors. Throughout the years of the IKG's work, there always loomed a great uncertainty. And still the community workers carried on, enabling emigration opportunities whenever possible. Up until emigration was prohibited from the Reich in October of 1941, the IKG continued to get people out. Even after the first mass deportations of Vienna's Jews commenced in February of 1941, emigration continued. In April of 1941, 19 persons emigrated to Europe, 2 to the United States, 13 to South and Central America. In May 1941, more people left. Between April and September of 1941, Jews continued to emigrate due to the persistent effort of the IKG workers. Still, it was not enough. 1941 was the turning point. And in 1942, we see the deportation of over 32,000 Jews from Vienna. In the chart above, we see a figure. In the chart above, we see a figure of 43,000 Jews in January of 1942, and that number is reduced to 7,989 by the end of the year. The last mass transport and the largest transport to ever leave Vienna carried 1,306 persons. This left for Theresienstadt on the 9th of October, 1942. Many IKG workers were included on this transport. They were not spared deportation due to their years of service to the community. They were sent away with the remaining Jews of Vienna. And on the 23rd of November 1942, the IKG was changed to the Council of Jewish Elders in Vienna. The German authorities permitted the new council to maintain a couple essential institutions, such as a hospital, old age home, and soup kitchen, for the approximate 8,000 remaining members who were predominantly Jews in mixed marriages and other privileged Jews. The aim of this presentation has been to shed light on the tireless work of the IKG in the years 1938 and beyond, to help facilitate the emigration and what they thought was the permanent rescue of Vienna's Jews. The result of the IKG's efforts was the preservation of the Jewish community of Vienna. A byproduct of its efforts was the organic development of a more cohesive and unified Viennese Jewish community than existed prior to Anschluss. The IKG, the institution, leadership, and workers operated as an essential tool in the escape of over 120,000 persons. Those who served this institution are often overlooked, and wrongfully so. They are the ordinary heroes that emerge within the history of the Holocaust, individuals whose patience, diligence, and often selflessness enabled so many others to carry on. The IKG was organized, the IKG was efficient, the IKG was patient, and the IKG was resilient. Thank you. Oh, it went off. Something I touched. Technical. Oh, there it is. There we go.
Can I start? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I will present here two cases of, to my mind, and as far as we know, the earliest expulsion of Jewish citizens from the territory of the Third Reich, which happened in Austria. We've had partial information about these events that I will be talking about since the 1980s. And at first sight, and for many decades actually, they have been regarded as uncoordinated actions of local thugs in the area called Burgenland, the western province of Austria. I will try to show you where we are. So here is a map of Austria, and we are talking about the easternmost province to your right, and you see that there is a little lake here, and it's the area around the lake here that we are talking about, and the villages I will be mentioning are all from this marked area. Vienna is to the left, Bratislava is just across the line and border here to the top right. My argument will be that these expulsions, for which there was no legal basis, not even under Nazi law when they happened, were actually not uncoordinated events, but they were part of a planned and calculated escalation of the Nazi authorities in their policy towards the Jewish population. I think, and that will be my argument, that the Nazis were trying, it was an experiment. They were trying to sound out the situation. They were waiting for international response and finally testing the waters, and finding them lukewarm were actually encouraged to intensify the persecution of Jews, which then ended finally in this big administrative machinery that the two other speakers before me have been talking about, for the expropriation, deportation, and finally murder of Austrian Jews. We are here in this area. One of the largest villages here was Frauenkirchen, which had a Jewish community since 1620. So for over 300 years prior to the expulsion. And it's here in this village, you can see the synagogue here, that only 13 days after the Anschluss, Gestapo arrives on the 26th of March and announces to these families that you see here, all together, you see that the numbers represent the persons in the family, 26 people, that they have to get on a lorry and they are being taken by night north towards the border with Czechoslovakia, then Czechoslovakia, where to the river Danube. They are being ferried across the Danube and they are being put on a sandbank in the river Danube, but already technically speaking on Czechoslovak territory. Oops. So you have the map here, and I don't know if there is a pointer, but you can see Bratislava, and the village we are talking about is just down here. So they are taken up there some 15 miles, put on a boat across the Danube, and there in the morning they are being found by villagers who inform the Jewish community, as to be more precise, the secretary of the Orthodox Jewish community of Bratislava, a person called Aaron Grünhut, that you will be hearing about. And it's Aaron Grünhut who actually arranges for this group then being taken across the border. What you see here is Hungary already, and from here organizes their evacuation then to Budapest. 4 of the families that you saw here will make it as refugees to the United States. It's the first document expulsion here, and Aaron Grünhut writes about it in his book, which he later will publish in the 70s in Tel Aviv. A few days before Purim, from Frauenkirchen in Burgenland, were driven across the Hungarian border. They were stopped by the Hungarian border guards, accompanied to a stable. So he describes the whole situation here, and his intervention in Budapest is successful, and then they finally manage them to get them across the border and take them to other countries. There is no reaction whatsoever in the international press to this expulsion, so there you see his publication that I was quoting from. This is the border station here that we were talking about between Kice, which is on the Austrian side, Jarovce, which is on the Czechoslovak side. Here, side, oops. And you see this, we've been talking about the problem of quotas. The Austrian quota for US visas at the time was 1,413. And applications by 7th April 1938 was 30,000. A problem that, as you all know, will not be solved by the Conference of Evian, which is then to be held a few months later, where it turns out that none of the countries, or very few of the countries, are willing to take any refugees at all or alter their quota. So the first expulsion having been successful, a second one follows about a month later. Now, this is a little bit better documented, and it's again Aaron Grünhut who is involved here, because the same thing happens. The same local authorities now select a much larger group. Here we don't have so clear numbers. And again, they put them across the border, this time into Hungary. Now, Aaron Grünhut is already more experienced. He gets in contact with the Joint. He gets in contact with different papers. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency already on the 11th of April has the news and is distributing the news about this expulsion. Again, it happens in the same area. Again, this little village. If you look here on the Danube a little bit to the south, about in the middle of the map, there is a place called Reich, and this is where these refugees will end up for a long time. So the Jewish Telegraphic Agency carries the news. Reaction is sort of not really overwhelming. There is a short article in the New York Times, which is published on the 14th of April. I will show you the article. I had the good fortune to meet survivors of this deportation more than 25 years ago and to interview them, and that's what started me off on this research altogether. One of the families was the family Roth from Gols that you can see here, one of the villages in the area. And they were taken to the village in Reuk. Aaron Grünhut manages, because there is a problem, that the Hungarian authorities will not really allow them in because most of them don't have any documents whatsoever. So the solution that Aaron Grünhut, as the secretary of the Jewish community, manages somehow to achieve a compromise with the customs officers is that he hires a boat on the Danube, a tug, so-called tug, which is anchored in the Danube. So it's in a way in Hungary, but not really in Hungary. And he gets the Jewish community of nearby Reuk to provide food and the necessities for the people on this boat. The family of the Roth family in Israel has a rather good collection of photographs from their months on the boat. They will be there for nearly 3 months on this boat in the summer of 1938. Another collection is here in the United States with a family in Chicago. So we have quite good documentation about the people who were on the boat. As you can see here, so even most of the people are identified on the photographs. And most of them actually manage to go to Budapest, where they further travel to other countries. Hungary, then Yugoslavia, and Israel can be organized. I don't know why this is not moving. So there is an article here that you can see on the 21st of April in the New York Times. Aaron Grünhut organizes or arranges for a reporter from the New York Times called Knickerbocker to come down from Paris, and he visits the boat and he writes this short piece in the New York Times, but that's about it. So there is no other reaction, and the persons, as I said, we have identified, also because the local Nazi authorities have actually really documented this deportation fairly well. So I think we can't really continue to think that this was an uncoordinated event. So the people from the different villages that were on the boat are really very well documented, and they are taken finally from here, as I said, to Budapest. Ignaz Roth, in a long interview that I did take with him in 1994, describes the whole story, how they were taken out of their beds, and then comes one of the more interesting parts. His father was confronted with the choice either to be shot on the spot or to sign away the family's property. So there were prepared contracts, and they had to sign over everything to specially prepared bank accounts for a fund which the Nazis had already set up, and it was called the Fund for the Emigration of Poor Burgenland Jews. And he describes this in this interview very well. The interview is 1.5 hours long. There is also one with his sister, and the whole procedure is described in great detail, how this happens. Different international Jewish organizations get involved in the rescue of these people, and as I said, they finally managed to make their way here with first to Romania, and then with the ship Romania from Constantia, they will arrive in Israel. There was the events that I described here were published in 1939 in a novel, or a kind of documentary novel by Peter de Mendelssohn, which came out in London in 1939, Across the Dark River, and reaction was nearly nil. And I think, as I said, we know that Vienna was the place where the model for the expropriation, deportation, and organized deportation and then later murder of the Jews was worked out in the so-called Vienna model, the Wiener Modell, published by a Viennese historian, Hans Safrian, in his books in 1993 and then later on in a later version in 2010, where he describes how this central agency for Jewish emigration, the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, which was established in the summer of 1938 in Vienna, serves as a later model for the policy against Jews in the German Reich. Thank you. And I think there is enough information to argue that the Burgenland events actually are a sort of early experiment which lead up to this. First of all, because there is very prominent Nazis involved in these two Burgenland expulsions. One is Otto Bovensiepen, a Gestapo chief who is present in Burgenland at the time and who is responsible for most of the financial sides of the things, and Alois Brunner is there. Alois Brunner, who comes back from Germany with already lists of Jewish property in Burgenland, and if you look at the timeline, and this will be my end, on the 26th of March we have the first expulsion. Alois Brunner is already there in Burgenland with his prepared lists of people. At the same time, the Gestapo in Eisenstadt sets up the bank accounts for this fund for the emigration of poor Austrian Jews. The Reichsnähestand, which is actually a legal body in Nazi Germany, which is responsible for food regulations, but this is where Brunner officially works. And he works for this organization, and they do actually appoint the so-called Kommissarische Verwalter, the provisional custodians of Jewish shops and properties. On 20th of April, the second expulsion. On 18th of May, then Eichmann sets up the Vermögensverkehrsstelle in Vienna with the Ministry of Trade, and they take over these funds from the Auswanderungsamt. So there's a special office for the emigration of Burgenland Jews on which Eichmann builds, and the Burgenland Jews, all the Jews in Burgenland, are handed eviction papers already in June 1938. So before all the other evictions happen, they are forced to leave the province. And on the 20th of August 1938, then finally, the Central Office for the Jewish Emigration is set up by Eichmann, and it is then Alois Brunner that he moves there. So I think we can maybe speak of a timeline of calculated escalation, as I said, which encouraged the Nazis, since there was no international protest, to continue their murderous and intensify their murderous policy. Thank you very much.
So, hello everybody, my name is Winfried Garscha, Friedel, as I was called already, and I see my task today to set up some figures and to give you a short outline of the state of research about expulsion and extermination of Austrian Jews. This is a conference on rescue, but what's the topic of my talk here is those who did not make it to escape the Nazi persecution. We do not have exact numbers about the Jews in Austria on the 15th of March. You saw the number of 181,708. This was what was officially registered at the IKJ. Maybe they are some more, as we know. 20 years ago, there was a booklet written by Johnny Moser. Johnny Moser was, he wrote his late already, Johnny Moser, but he wrote a book about his role in the rescue staff of Raoul Wallenberg. His family had survived the Holocaust in Hungary. He too, he came originally from the Burgenland. Later, they moved to Vienna. And he studied history later, and he worked as one of those historians who did lots of, although he never made it to a university, to highlight the fate of the Austrian Jews. And one of his main specialities was numbers, and he tried to calculate the actual number of Austrian Jews. So I put it here. It was 181,900. It's a little bit more than those who were registered at the IKJ. The Austrian Nazis, they had their own count because according to the racist Nazi Nuremberg laws, it was more. It was 206,000, but these were all those who were regarded as Jews by the Nazis. The Jewish population in Vienna, the Jewish population in Vienna is completely different because the majority of the Austrian Jews lived in Vienna. So you see, according to the Nazi count, it was almost 11%. According to those who were registered at the IKJ, and if you consider emigration, conversions, and birth and death, so you reach a number of 167,250 Jews. This is 9.3% of the Viennese population. And one of the main tasks of the Nazi, both of the mayor and of the Gauleiter, but also of Adolf Eichmann, was to get rid of all those Jews, either by emigration or, if this is not possible, by deportations. The first deportation experiment Eichmann managed in not only in Vienna, also in Mährisch Ostrau, in Ostrava, in occupied Czechoslovakia, which was then the Protectorate, was to Nisko on the River San. Nisko was only the train station. The Jews were shipped over the San and had to build up their facilities for a planned Jewish reservation in southeast Poland. So this experiment started in late October 1939, so the war was just over, the war against Poland, and in some parts of Poland there were still fights between rests of the Polish army, and also it was already after the invasion of the Soviet troops to eastern Poland, and so the demarcation line between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was not yet established definitely, although there were already treaties about that, and this enabled the SS men who were responsible for those Jews to chase those Jews who they regarded superfluous for the small facilities established near Nisko, and to tell them, go to the Soviet Union, go on the other side of the demarcation line. All in all, this was a group of 4,760 Jewish men, it was only men, coming from Mährisch Austria, Vienna, and Katowice. Katowice was among those parts of Poland who had been annexed by Germany already at that time. And from Vienna, there were 2 transports on the 20th and the 26th of October with 1,584 men. What's interesting that it did not work, because at that time when the Viennese transport started, Eichmann was already told by his superiors from Berlin to stop the whole operation, and he continued nevertheless, but they could not establish this planned Jewish reservation in the Lublin district in southeast Poland, and so they chased the Jews somewhere, and most of them made it across the demarcation line to the Soviet Union. We have some information about that by 2 books, published, one in the Czech lands and the other in Austria. The Austrian book is from Johnny Moser again. But what we do not know until now is more information about the fate of those who made it on the other side of the demarcation line to the Soviet Union, which was the mass majority. Only 500 could go back to their home cities, among them 200 to Vienna. And what we want to do is, from the side of the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, is to do research into the biographies of those who had crossed the demarcation line, who most of them lived for a certain time in Lemberg, in Lviv, as it is called today. And now it's part of the Ukraine. And many of them got arrested by the Soviet authorities because they had crossed the border without allowances, without visa, and were deported to Siberia or to Karaganda, most of them to Karaganda in what's now Kazakhstan. Those had a chance to survive. Those who fitted into the Soviet rules in Lemberg, they were killed by 100% by the Nazis when they invaded the Soviet Union 1.5 years later. So it's really an absurd situation that the Stalinist persecution saved so many Jewish lives, because the chance to survive in those camps was 50%. The chance to survive in Lemberg was 0%. This is the first experiment. It did not work, and for a certain period it seemed that the Jewish community in Vienna could proceed to facilitate emigration to other countries and also via Lisbon to the United States. But when the war had begun, it was clear that this will not work anymore. And after some months, the Gestapo decided to begin again with the deportation, and this time to occupied Poland, to the so-called general government. And they aimed to deport 15,000 Viennese Jews to the general government, but then the war on the Balkans began, because Mussolini started his attack against Greece, and so they had to stop that at the number of 5,000. It was 5 transports to 4 Polish cities. They are written in bold here, so you see 2 of those cities had been in the Lublin district, and the 2 others were near Kielce. The one transport was directly to Kielce, and the other to Ostrowiec, Świętokrzyżkie, and from there the Jews had to go by feet or by some other facilities to 2 villages, Lagów and Opatów, and there they could live for a certain time. Because in those small Polish towns at that time, the process of setting up ghettos had just begun at that time. Because they had the problem that they had so many refugees from the western parts of Poland, which had been annexed by Nazi Germany. And I myself had been in Opatów and talked to people there, and they told me we had a town of 10,000 inhabitants, 5,000 Jews, 5,000 Catholic Poles. And then 2,000 came from the western parts of Poland, and almost all of them were Jewish. And so the equilibrium in town was no more guaranteed. And now almost 1,000 more arrived from Vienna. And so the Poles had big problems with all that, because there was no more food, no more medicine, no more doctors. And what was the most complicated problem, this was water. Fresh water, and also the water which is dispersed. And so they said we really had to do something, and here this was the idea of the Polish authorities, which were responsible to the Germans, of course, and so they started to concentrate the Jews in a ghetto. This was similar in other of those small towns. For instance, in Moderator, the Jews were brought in the synagogue, which had been destroyed during the war in 1939. There was no roof. They had walls around them, but they had no roof, and so if it was raining or snowing, they had to stay there. This was the situation in February and March 1941, but again, this was not the situation of camps. It was even not the situation of secluded ghettos. They had brought there, and they had to ask the Polish Jewish population, please let us in. And so one family had let's say, an apartment of 2 rooms, and they had to share it with 2 other families, the one from Western Poland and the other from Vienna. And this, of course, produced diseases and other problems. The Nazis solved the problem by deporting all the Jews of those small towns 1.5 years later to the extermination camps. Then the deportations were stopped and were resumed in fall, winter 1941, 1942, and you had those the first mass transports to the ghettos. The first one, the first etap was to Litzmannstadt, which 5 transports of Viennese Jews, and also 5,000 Austrian Sinti and Roma. And the second target was Riga, the ghetto of Riga, and also there should be sent 5,000, but only 4,000 were sent to Riga, 1,000 to Kaunas, to Kovno, and there they were shot on the spot. In the other big ghetto in the east was the ghetto of Minsk. All in all, there were 7 transports to Minsk. One among them, the last one, came from Vienna, and the fate of the people there was that the majority did not survive the extremely cold and severe winter of 1941-1942, and those who had survived were shot or killed in gas vans in Malitrostinets, which was already in use at that time in the end of July 1942. In 1942, the mass deportation to the extermination sites began in Poland from Litzmannstadt ghetto, from which people were brought to Chełmno, to Kulmhof, and also you had the biggest extermination camp under German rule. It was Auschwitz-Birkenau, and it was inside then Nazi Germany. Yeah? It was not in occupied Poland. It was in the next part of Poland. There was only one big transport from Vienna to Auschwitz. All the others were brought from other destinations, most of them from Theresienstadt, but also from France and other countries where they had fled to. And then you had the deportations to the extermination sites on occupied Polish territories. You have here Włodawa. These Jews went directly to Sobibor later, and to Izbica. Izbica was just a waiting room for those Jews who had been gassed in Sobibor or Bełżec. On the occupied Soviet territories, you had these small extermination sites in the Baltics. The biggest one was Pikernieki, near the Riga ghetto. More than 4,000 Austrian Jews had been shot and gassed there. But the biggest one was the already mentioned extermination site of Mali Trostinets. I brought with me some leaflets, but it's in German, and it's interesting only for those of you who can read German. I will put it on disposal outside then, and you can have a look on it during the lunch break, because it informs about the already mentioned Döf yearbook of this year, and there you have it's dedicated to Mali Trostinets, and you have also the recent numbers, and these are in Minsk and Mali Trostinets. Almost 10,000 Austrian Jews were murdered there. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, it was some 11 or 12,000, so it's the second biggest place of murdering of Austrian Jews. Some of them, and this we learned only recently, were coming to Mali Trostinets and other killing sites from Theresienstadt, also Austrian Jews. And I want to conclude with the fate of those who were brought only to a ghetto, only to Theresienstadt, which in the reception of many people at that time was the less horrible option, but about 7,500 of these Austrian deportees were transferred to extermination camps, and over 6,000 died in Theresienstadt itself. All the numbers I gave you are always in discussion, and also on different websites you see different numbers. For instance, for Mali Trostinets you had 13,000 or so until recently. But let me say, taking Mali Trostinets, every single person brought there and murdered there is worth to commemorate, and it does not matter whether it's more or less than 10,000. Thank you.
It finally works. As I said before, we are going to have about 10 to 12 minutes for discussion. As you see here to your right, at the beginning of the stage here, we have a microphone, so please come down to give any questions you may have. Quickly identify yourself, and please make the questions brief, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions and we have run a little long. I already see a line forming, so I will let the games begin.
Yes, hello. My name is Paul Schatzberg. I was born in Vienna, Austria. I have one. Austria is and was a Catholic country, and so I've been very interested in the response of not only Catholics, but the Catholic clergy to the Austrian annexation to Germany. And in this respect, a number of things have been published, many in German and not available to English audience. But my question is, please, if someone could comment on the behavior and actions of Bishop Alois Hudal in his response and his efforts in helping high Austrian Nazis and high German Nazis escape to South America and elsewhere.
Do you gentlemen want to
Yeah,
take that over?
only one sentence.
The
I can
rabbi.
confirm what you said, and that's it. He helped Nazi perpetrators to escape, mass murderers. This was his role, and he never was punished by that, neither by a state organ nor by the Catholic Church.
So then, you know of the book Grüß Gott und Heil Hitler.
Yes,
Okay.
And the famous rat line, which helped
exactly.
Austrians out to safety. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the U.S. Diplomatic Service. I'd like to ask any of the panelists, perhaps maybe the first two speakers, what was the motivation of Roosevelt in assembling or calling for the conference at Evian? He knew what the environment was in the United States, obviously. Did he really think much was going to happen? We know that, in fact, there was very little that happened, but what was his motivation? Was it a ploy or what?
I think he saw the refugee crisis as an international problem that needed an international solution. But one of the things that he did, it got 32 member nations to attend, but he promised that none of them would have to change their immigration laws during the conference. So I think he hoped that discussion would lead to some act of generosity. And the conference did result in the formation of an international organization to try to assist with immigration based in London that lasts for the rest of the war. It doesn't have much of an impact, however.
Marty Bromwitz, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Of the 120,000 who were able to escape, are there any numbers of how many actually survived? They went to other countries who were taken over by the Germans? Was there any numbers?
Please.
I would say that there are no exact figures. Back to
Because many
Patricia's
individuals
presentation.
went, say, to Belgium, and then they were rounded up in Belgium. So that 120,000 who escaped, not all, or a good number of them perished.
Yes.
Okay. Also, was there a similar organization in Germany trying to get the Jews out of Germany? Was it as extensive as it appears
Yes.
it was in Austria?
For sure, and actually the Austrian system was somewhat modeled after the German system, which had already been running since '33.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all. My name's Robin Shaffer. My grandfather, Rudolf Schäfernick, was arrested on the street in Vienna shortly after the Anschluss, and interned first in Dachau and later in Buchenwald. And according to the family story, my grandmother went to Berlin and was able to secure his release, and then they got out and came here, and that's why I'm alive and named for him. And I would just ask if you could comment on how common that story is and how many Jews were interned in the camps from Vienna and then later were released.
Yes, so I actually write pretty extensively about that in my book, The Jews of Nazi Vienna. There's a chapter in there that discusses the release of the men from the initial transports to Dachau. That includes the men that were deported in May and June of 1938, and then also men that were deported after Kristallnacht. Almost 5 out of every 7 was released from the camp, and that was due to various endeavors organized by family members, by the IKG, through Gestapo, lots of
Wow, thank you.
arrangements. But it is a story that is more common than we realize. Yeah.
Thank you, and I look forward to reading more about it in your book.
Thanks.
Thanks to all, very illuminating. I'm Ruth Kurtzbauer, also a retired U.S. diplomat. It's kind of ironical because I was a U.S. consul, and my young dad and mom were saved in a way by the actions of a Vienna U.S. consul early in the summer of '38. But my question is also on U.S. visa policy at that time. So by and large, my grandparents did not make it out. And I was wondering on the quota situation, whether it's because they were all born in old Austria-Hungary, so one citizenship, but after 1918, their place of birth would have been somewhere in Poland or somewhere in Hungary. Was that a bar to being considered under the Austrian or German quota?
Oh, 100%. The U.S. had a difficult time establishing where you were, what quota you fell under if you were in the Austro-Hungarian regime. They ultimately set lines and set it based on that. And so if they were in Poland, they had, I believe the number is 6,524, as opposed if for people born in Vienna, as opposed to 27,370. And so what you got was families, all of whom may have been born in the same town, but as the borders changed in the years between their births, the quota that they fell under changed as well. So you'll have 4 people born in the same town, but if the borders changed, they could be under 4 different quota systems, some much more restrictive than
So
others.
that explains part of the mystery in our family's mind. The parents were born in Vienna, so there was a different quota.
You were always and forever where you were born according to the U.S. law.
Thank you very much.
My name is Charlotte Segal. I am also the book group coordinator of the second generation here in DC, and I want to thank you all for the extensive research that you've done, and specifically to Ilana Offenberger we read your book, and it was so personal, and I really appreciated all the specific names that you gave, and my grandmother, Charlotte Hirschbein, and your grandmother, Offenberger, were together when they were murdered, and that's pretty amazing that I was able to read about it in your book, as we never knew until we read your book. So, and I think it's pretty amazing with all these numbers that you give out that we're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Deborah Dwarf. I'm a Holocaust historian, and I will be speaking later on this afternoon. My question, first of all, thank you for this panel. Each of these presentations was rich and wonderful. I have questions for each of you, but I know that time is short, so I will restrict myself to one. And that is also for you, Ilana.
Thanks.
You emphasized to us quite rightly that the heroism of the IKG was enacted by ordinary people. Can you tell us something about these extraordinary, ordinary people? Women, men, young, old. Can you tell us something about who they were?
How much time do I have?
We have about 2 more minutes in the program, so I'm afraid Bettina is going to be the last question there, but we'll arrange for you guys to get your questions answered. I'm sorry.
So thank you for asking the question. All I can say is that in the book I have written extensively about all of the individual families and people who worked together to help to facilitate the greater good of the community. And they, after reading all of the papers and looking at the efforts of these people, I felt that that was the angle to within which to present this community, really as the ordinary heroes, and maybe that's a message for us today too. Thank you.
Our last question. I'm sorry that we're running out of time.
Hello, my name is Bettina Brandt. I'll be speaking later today on the program, and I'm also currently a fellow here at the museum. My question is...
Bettina is a tall lady. There we go.
Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. I have a question for Winfried Garscha. Could you tell me how those who were deported to Opole and Kielce in February of 1941, how they were selected to be on those transports?
Yeah, the selection was very complicated because it was up to the IKG to provide people to the Gestapo, and the Gestapo, they again selected whom of those 1,200 who had been presented to them should be deported. And it was always a very, very complicated task. And yeah, you can read lots of this in the book of
But does it have anything to do with citizenship? Would
No,
these have
no,
been
no,
people who would have been born in Poland or other reasons or other places?
No,
It was completely random?
Not from the research that I have.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it wasn't. I would not say it was completely random. But first, the IKG was asked to compile the lists, and then they, at some point, refused to continue compiling the lists. And usually, the lists that they did draw up were not fully taken into consideration, anyways. So it did have to do with, depending on which deportations you're talking about, it depended on what they were looking for. So
Right. I just know
first,
3 people on these transports, and they were adult women with single children.
Well, it also depends on the time period. So if we're talking about closer to 1941, many of the younger people in the community have already emigrated, and you're left with a community that's more heavily populated by women. There's more women in the community by 1941, 1942 anyway, so perhaps that's why you're seeing some of those results.
They seem more vulnerable to me, but anyway, who knows?
More vulnerable.
Well, they were not families; they were single women with children.
Yes, that very well might be part of it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. I'm so sorry to those of you. I imagine some of you still have questions, and perhaps for those of you, especially who came down to ask a question, perhaps you can corner your favorite speaker here this morning and get your questions answered.
Your least favorite speaker.
Or your least favorite. We'll resume again at 1:15. Please join me in thanking our speakers.